On the night of June 16, 1943, a woman descended from Indian royalty climbed into a small aircraft in England, carrying a false identity card, a concealed radio transmitter, and a code name that would soon make her the single most wanted British agent operating inside Nazi-occupied Paris. Within 10 days of landing in a field outside Angers, the resistance network she had been sent to join would collapse entirely around her. Its leaders arrested, its safe houses compromised, its survival hanging on whether one inexperienced wireless operator could keep transmitting alone in a city crawling with Gestapo detection vans. For as long as it took London to find a way to bring her home, she did not come home. What happened to her instead is one of the most documented, most brutal, and most quietly heroic stories to come out of the entire European resistance, and almost nobody outside specialist historical circles has ever heard her real name. Noor-un-Nisa Inayat Khan was born on January 1, 1914, in a monastery in Moscow, an origin so unlikely for a future British spy that it almost sounds invented. Her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, was an Indian Sufi teacher and classical musician, a direct descendant of Tipu Sultan, the 18th century ruler of Mysore, remembered in Indian history as the Tiger of Mysore, who died fighting against British colonial expansion in 1799. This lineage meant that Noor-un-Nisa Khan was, by direct royal descent, an actual Indian princess. A fact that sits in uneasy, fascinating tension with what she would eventually risk her life doing on behalf of the British Empire. Her own ancestor had died resisting. Her mother, born Ora Ray Baker in New Mexico, was an American who had met Inayat Khan in San Francisco during one of his international performance tours, taking the name Amina Begum after their marriage. The family lived briefly in Moscow, fled the rising political tension that would soon erupt into revolution, and eventually settled outside Paris in a home Inayat Khan named Fazal Manzil, the House of Blessing. Noor grew up in an environment soaked in music, Sufi philosophy, and constant visitors drawn to her father's teaching, a childhood that produced a gentle, introspective young woman who would go on to write children's stories and compose music, not someone whose early life pointed toward espionage in any obvious way. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the family fled again, this time to England, and Noor, now 26 years old, immediately enlisted in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force as a wireless operator. Her fluency in French, combined with her wireless training, eventually brought her to the attention of the Special Operations Executive, the secret British organization Winston Churchill had personally ordered into existence, specifically to, in his words, set Europe ablaze through sabotage and resistance support across occupied territory. The reaction to Noor among SOE training instructors was sharply divided, and this is a detail the more romanticized retellings of her story tend to smooth over. Several of her trainers expressed genuine doubt about whether she had the psychological toughness the role demanded. Reports describe concerns about her sensitivity, her apparent lack of athleticism, and an unmistakable melancholy that surfaced during the brutally realistic mock Gestapo interrogations every SOE recruit endured before deployment. At least one officer recommended she not be sent into the field at all. Her file contains genuine, documented, professional disagreement about whether this gentle musician's daughter was suited for what amounted to a 6-week life expectancy in the most dangerous wireless operator role in occupied Europe. She was sent anyway, partly because the demand for trained French-speaking radio operators had become desperate, and partly because, despite the doubts, her technical performance during training had been excellent. The Special Operations Executive that recruited Noor operated under a mandate that sounds almost theatrical when stated plainly, and yet was deadly serious in practice. Formed in July 1940 at Churchill's direct order, SOE existed entirely outside the normal chains of military command, answerable to a small circle of officials rather than the broader military establishment, specifically because its mission, organizing sabotage and armed resistance inside territory, the regular army could not reach, required a level of secrecy and operational flexibility conventional forces could not provide. The organization, recruited from an unusually wide pool of candidates by the standards of 1940s Britain, women alongside men, foreign nationals alongside British citizens, anyone with language skills, local knowledge, or simply the nerve required for work that came with no guarantee of survival, and, for captured agents, no protection whatsoever under the laws of war governing prisoners in uniform. Wireless operators occupied a uniquely exposed position within this entire system. Unlike couriers who could often blend into ordinary civilian movement, a radio operator needed to carry, conceal, and operate a transmitter heavy and conspicuous enough that German direction-finding technology, mounted in unmarked vans that patrolled occupied cities, specifically hunting for radio signals, could often narrow a transmission's location to a single building within minutes of broadcast. This is the specific, mechanical reason the 6-week average survival estimate existed. It was not a vague statistical guess, but a grim mathematical reality, calculated from how quickly German detection technology could close the distance between a signal and the person sending it. On June 16, 1943, under the code name Madeleine, she parachuted into France along with 3 other agents, all 4 of whom would eventually die in German custody. She made contact with the Prosper Network, the most significant SOE resistance organization operating in the Paris region. 10 days after her arrival, the Gestapo arrested the network's 3 central leaders. Under what investigators later determined was brutal interrogation, information extracted from those leaders led to hundreds of additional arrests across the French resistance and its civilian allies within weeks. By mid-August, Noor-un-Nisa Khan was the only British wireless operator still functioning in Paris. This single fact deserves to sit with you for a moment, because it represents an almost unimaginable operational burden. London urgently wanted to extract her, recognizing correctly how exposed she had become. She refused, insisting she was the only working link between the Paris resistance and London, and that abandoning the post now would cut off communications entirely at the worst possible moment. For the next 3 months, this 29-year-old woman, doing work normally distributed across an entire team of 6 radio operators, kept transmitting alone, relaying targets for weapons drops, coordinating funds and arms shipments to resistance fighters, and arranging escape routes for downed Allied airmen trapped behind enemy lines. She survived through constant, exhausting, evasive tactics. She changed her transmission location repeatedly, kept every broadcast as brief as physically possible to avoid German direction-finding vans triangulating her position, and frequently altered her appearance, dyeing her hair to avoid recognition from any description the Gestapo might be circulating. In one documented incident that captures both her composure and the constant tightrope she was walking, a German officer living in her own apartment building noticed her stringing a radio aerial along a tree branch outside her window and offered to help, having no idea he was personally assisting a British agent install equipment that would, within the hour, be transmitting intelligence directly to London. She thanked him, let him help, and got back to work. In London, her supervisors were stunned by her endurance. Average life expectancy for a wireless operator working under these exact conditions in 1943 was approximately 6 weeks. Noor-un-Nisa Khan operated alone in the most dangerous city in occupied Europe for roughly 3 months, with code work her own superiors described as flawless. The collapse of the Prosper network that nearly ended Noor's mission before it properly began is itself a story tangled in unresolved historical controversy. The agent who provided bicycles to Noor and her fellow arrivals upon landing, Henri Dericourt, has been the subject of decades of historical suspicion, with multiple researchers concluding he was very likely operating simultaneously as a German double agent, feeding information to the Gestapo, even while ostensibly serving SOE. Whether Dericourt's actions directly caused the catastrophic arrests that followed or whether the network's collapse resulted from other intelligence failures entirely, remains genuinely disputed among historians who have spent careers examining surviving SOE and German records. What is not disputed is the outcome. Within 10 days of Noor's arrival, an entire resistance network's leadership was in German custody, and the young woman who had just landed in France found herself, through no failure of her own, suddenly the last functioning link in a chain that had been severed everywhere else. If 3 months of solo radio operation under a 6-week life expectancy does not impress you, subscribe to Operatives Untold right now, because what happened after her capture is going to be far harder to listen to than anything that came before it. In October 1943, Noor-un-Nisa Khan was betrayed and arrested by the Gestapo. The precise circumstances of her betrayal remain debated by historians, with some accounts pointing toward a French woman connected to the compromised network, though the full picture has never been definitively settled. What is not debated is an operational mistake that historians treat with appropriate honesty rather than hagiography. Noor had kept handwritten copies of her own secret coded transmissions in violation of strict SOE security protocol. When the Gestapo recovered these notebooks, German intelligence officers were able to convincingly impersonate her in continued radio contact with London, an act of deception that, according to multiple historical accounts, contributed directly to the capture and death of additional Allied agents who believed they were still communicating with a secure operative. This detail matters because it refuses to let her story collapse into uncomplicated martyrdom. Noor-un-Nisa Khan was extraordinarily brave under conditions that broke far more experienced operatives. She was also human, exhausted, operating alone under impossible pressure, and she made a documented mistake with real consequences for people who trusted the line of communication she represented. Both facts are true. Honest history has room for both. Noor's 2 documented escape attempts from German custody, the very acts of defiance that led the Gestapo to classify her as exceptionally dangerous, reveal something about her character that the more passive language of victimhood, often used in retellings of captured agents' stories, tends to obscure. According to surviving German records and post-war testimony, she attempted to flee custody on separate occasions during her imprisonment, efforts that ultimately failed, but that German authorities took seriously enough to factor directly into decisions about her classification and treatment. A prisoner judged docile or broken does not typically warrant the level of restraint, isolation, and continuous shackling that Noor endured for 10 consecutive months at Pforzheim. The severity of her confinement was, in its own grim way, an unintentional acknowledgement by her captors of exactly how much fight remained in her even after capture. What followed her arrest is where her story becomes almost unbearable to recount, and where her actual courage becomes impossible to romanticize away, because nothing about what came next required any embellishment. The Gestapo considered her a high-value prisoner, in part because she had attempted escape from custody not once but twice. She was transferred to Pforzheim prison in Germany in late November 1943, where she spent the next 10 months in solitary confinement, shackled at both hands and feet in restraints that, by multiple accounts, prevented her from standing fully upright. She endured repeated beatings and systematic food deprivation across these 10 months. She never gave up a single name. She did not even confirm her own real identity to her captors. Her interrogator in Paris, a German officer named Ernst Vogt, later told her biographer that he had never encountered anyone quite like her, and that he genuinely admired her courage and her kindness, despite representing the regime torturing her for information. On September 11, 1944, 3 months after Allied forces had landed at Normandy, Noor-un-Nisa Khan was abruptly transferred to Dachau concentration camp, traveling alongside 3 other female SOE agents who had likewise survived months of imprisonment without breaking: Yolande Beekman, Madeleine Damamont, and Eliane Plumen. Some historical accounts drawing on testimony collected after the war suggests that during her final hours at Dachau, she may have been singled out for additional brutality beyond what her three companions experienced, with at least one source attributing this specifically to how German guards perceived her as visibly non-European. This particular claim rests on more limited, corroborating testimony than the broader, extensively documented facts of her imprisonment and execution, and deserves to be presented with that appropriate caution rather than stated as settled certainty. What is documented without dispute through post-war testimony from German personnel present at the camp is this. In the early hours of September 13, 1944, the four women were brought from their barrack into the camp yard. Noor-un-Nisa Khan was executed with a single gunshot alongside her three companions. Her reported last word was liberté, French for freedom. Her remains were disposed of in the camp crematorium that same morning. Noor-un-Nisa Khan was posthumously awarded the George Cross, the United Kingdom's highest civilian decoration for gallantry, in 1949, and France's Croix de Guerre avec Étoile de Vermeil in 1946. For decades afterward, her story remained largely unknown outside specialist circles studying SOE operations, until historian Shrabani Basu's 2006 biography, Spy Princess, brought her story to wider public attention. In 2020, she became the first woman of South Asian descent, honored with an official blue plaque in London, placed at her final wartime address in Bloomsbury, the same address she had scratched into a prison bowl while held in solitary confinement, hoping someone might one day connect that address back to her name. The biography that finally rescued Noor-un-Nisa Khan from historical obscurity deserves specific credit for the scale of public memory she now receives. Shrabani Basu's 2006 book, Spy Princess, drew on years of archival research, including access to SOE personnel files and post-war war crimes testimony from German officers who had directly interrogated or guarded Noor, material that had remained scattered and largely unexamined by popular historians for 60 years after the war ended. Basu's research directly enabled the broader public recognition that followed. The 2020 Blue Plaque increased academic attention to SOE's South Asian and ethnic minority agents more broadly, and a string of film and television adaptations that, while sometimes taking dramatic liberties, brought her name to audiences who had simply never encountered it through standard wartime history curricula focused overwhelmingly on European and white Allied figures. This pattern of historical obscurity, followed by decades later rediscovery, is not unique to Noor-un-Nisa Khan. It reflects a broader, well-documented tendency in how Western popular memory of the Second World War initially formed. A tendency that for decades made very little room for the substantial, well-documented contributions of South Asian, African, and other non-European individuals who served, fought, and frequently died within Allied resistance and intelligence networks. Noor's eventual recognition came only after a biographer was willing to spend years in archives. Most popular historians had simply never thought to search. There is a final layer to her story that deserves to close this video, because it complicates any simple narrative of imperial heroism in exactly the way honest history should. Noor-un-Nisa Khan was, by her own stated convictions, a supporter of Indian independence from British rule. According to her biographer, she told British Army recruiters directly that once the war against Germany ended, her loyalties might well shift toward supporting Indian independence over continued service to the British Empire, that her own ancestor, Tipu Sultan, had died fighting more than a century earlier. She fought for Britain, not out of uncomplicated loyalty to the empire that governed her father's homeland, but because she found Nazi ideology and its explicit doctrine of racial hierarchy fundamentally incompatible with everything her Sufi upbringing had taught her about human dignity and religious tolerance. A princess descended from a king who died resisting British rule, fighting and dying for the British war effort against something she considered even more dangerous than colonialism itself. That contradiction is not a flaw in her story. It is the most honest part of it. If you want the real history behind the Operatives the war erased, subscribe to Operatives Untold because next week we go somewhere even darker.